3DM. This morning we have just a little brief clip to share with you of somebody else who's been on the journey with 3DM. As Jeff said yesterday, the leadership team here, we are all practitioners, so we are fellow journeyers with you in trying to develop an understanding for what discipleship and mission looks like in our context. And so we have a little video from a man named Grant, who is from The Ohio State University. Don't hold it against him. He's just trying to follow as best as he can, just like us.
My name is Grant Eckhart, and I serve as pastor at Jacob's Porch, which is a college ministry at The Ohio State University. And my first impression of 3DM actually goes back before there was a 3DM, to 2004 and into 2005, when I met Mike Breen at a conference in Arizona. He had just come over from England, and this was a conference that was dealing with essentially attractional evangelism, and had heard things all week about how to put together the right slides for worship, how to make a good coffee bar, those types of things. But what Mike was talking about was very different. It was something different than what I'd heard at conferences before, and it really captured my imagination. As I stood listening to him speak about his experience in Sheffield, it sounded like something from the future, something that didn't sound like the church as I knew it. He was talking about a church that didn't have walls, a church that was on the streets, a church that was really engaging discipleship in a way that was raising up leaders, talking about how God was moving in and through their communities, through these extended families on mission. And I was just struck by the contrast with what I was hearing from everyone else. And after hearing Mike, I was kind of sold on the idea. I didn't want to do church like I had done it before. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew that I didn't want that. I didn't want to be a cruise ship director, so to speak. I wanted to do something that had more flavor of the kind of Christianity that I fell in love with to begin with, something that really had Jesus at the center.
So last night we spent some time talking a little bit about, just like I said, the overview for 3DM, some of the programming language that we use, starting with Scripture always, and then talking about our primary lens, or the primary DNA, as we understand it, of the Scriptures, that of covenant and kingdom. And then Lynn Ann helped you understand just sort of how we go about encouraging people to become more and more like Christ, balancing the way of Jesus in how we disciple other people. And you remember the exercise we finished with last night. How do we balance invitation and challenge the way that Jesus did, so as to produce breakthrough and growth in the lives of people who are following Jesus? But what I think we haven't done so far is really talk about why this is a conversation that needs to happen. Why is this something that's brought you here today? Maybe you're feeling a need or something in your context, or maybe it's just curiosity because somebody invited you and you said, well, out of honor in that relationship, I'm going to show up today. But what's happening is in the church today is a conversation that needs to happen, and a realization that you just heard from Grant that the way that church has been operating hasn't been effectively delivering the things that it should. And so let me begin by bringing back a study that was done a little over 10 years ago at Willow Creek. The study was called Reveal. Some of you may be familiar with when Willow Creek did this. They actually started this study in 2004 and analyzed 6,000 surveys that they gave out to attendees of Willow Creek. They analyzed surveys from 300 people who had left Willow Creek. And then 3 years later, they did another survey, and they analyzed the data from 5,000 additional surveys. So you can see that it's a pretty broad spectrum of the people who either participated in worship and church activities at Willow Creek or who had previously and no longer did. They also conducted 120 in-depth interviews with people regarding spirituality. So not only did they do the online paper thing, but they also sat down with people. And what they found was they were operating from an assumption before they did the research. The assumption was this: the more a person far from God participates in church activities, the more likely it is those activities will produce a person who loves God and loves others. In other words, the more someone attends something at church, they're going to grow as disciples. Right? So, they found that this assumption was invalid based on the research. To quote the study, does increased attendance in ministry programs automatically equate to spiritual growth? To be brutally honest, it does not. So the question that I have for you is, how did we get there? How did we get to that point where we assume...
Might need to turn the power on. Sorry, but my bad.
Can you just do it for me, Adrian? So much easier. I'm going to put this down so I'm not tempted. How did we get to the point at which we assume that just by having more and more people showing up to church activities that they're going to grow as disciples? And how did that become an indicator of success? Well, let me bring this back to Scripture again. So if you have your Bibles with you, I invite you to open them with me to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. What we're after is building a discipling culture, right? We want, 3-4 years down the road to do this exercise again and have everybody be able to confidently and truthfully put their sticky notes up here. And it's something that we can get excited about. I hope that it's something that we can get excited about, because ultimately that's what we want to build, is a place where people can engage and listen to it and respond to the voice of the Father in a faithful sort of way. But something is missing. We're not accomplishing that, as that study reveals. So let's take a look at Luke chapter 22, and we'll read verses 24 to 30. So before we read it, let me set the context for you. This is Jesus sitting down with his disciples at the Last Supper, where he's telling them, look, I'm not going to be with you much longer, and here is something that you can do to remember me by, and so that whenever you do this, I am present there with you, and it's a means of grace in the presence of Jesus. And I don't know how many of you have ever had this experience where you're conducting communion or the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper in your congregation and a dispute breaks out among the church. Any of you ever had that before? No. Apparently it only happened the first time. So Jesus is sitting amongst his friends, and verse 24 says, also a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be greatest. Can you imagine that? I mean, it just sounds ridiculous, but there it is. And Jesus said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who's at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials, and I confer on you a kingdom, just as my Father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Jesus is conferring upon them a kingdom in which they get to have a seat of honor, a throne in which they get to rule over the kingdom. And so you hear some of those common themes that we talked about last night, right? The idea of covenant. Jesus uses the word confer. It's another word for covenant. So what he's doing is, by this relationship, with his disciples who have been with him in his trials. He is conferring upon them. He's giving to them, by this relationship, a kingdom. And so the disciples are going, cool, the benefits of this kingdom sound pretty amazing, right? We get a seat of honor, we get thrones, and we rule over them. But Jesus makes a distinction in that kingdom. It says the Gentiles, the kings of the Gentiles, lord it over each other. So they exercise power and authority from above, and that's how they rule their kingdoms. Jesus says, not so with you. Rather, you have been among me, and I came among you as one who serves. And so he says, the authority and the ruling and the leadership of this kingdom is not from above, but rather from beneath and beside. Jesus says, that's the kind of kingdom I have come to create. That's the kingdom that I'm now giving to you. And that's the kind of kingdom in which you have power and authority given from God to me and now to you. Rule differently. Lead differently. At the time of Jesus, power and authority was given to very few. The Roman Empire, right? And in that space, those few people had power, and they kept their power by providing for a few of the people. Jesus says, your power comes from serving. What happened? The disciples took it to heart, right? Lydia talked about it last night. Jesus invests in 12 people who impact change throughout the world. They start grasping onto this idea of serving and being among and extending the authority and power of God in a creation that's not used to that kind of service and power and authority. And people start becoming attracted to this kind of thing and joining up this family of God that's growing. And give or take 250, 270 years, Christianity is actually recognized as an official religion. So if you consider in the time of Jesus and shortly thereafter, where the state was persecuting Christians, Nero was putting people to death, Christians to death as sport that people came to watch. By the time the Edict of Milan in the year 313, Christianity is declared legal. It has a legal state. It's no longer legal to persecute Christians. And then later, the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, Christianity is not just tolerated, but now it is the official state religion. The only one. And so you can see how it's gone from this minority movement with a handful of people in an upper room discussing what power and authority looks like, to now suddenly have a place of honor and power and authority in society. But what's interesting about that time is there's a turning point. Because the Roman Empire that has recognized the official status of Christianity now starts to fall apart. And so the state, as we know it, ceases to exist as a result of several factors over the course of time. And power is decentralized from the center part of the state out into the countryside. And what happens is, as the power is decentralized, the church, which is still the remaining structure of society, receives a lot of that power. And by the time we get to the 700s with Charlemagne, you start to see this social contract in place. So you go from centralized power in Rome to the people with the land now have the power. And it said that Charlemagne was the one who started to say, well, I will give you land if you pledge allegiance to me, if you pledge loyalty to me. And because there was still power within the church in all of these regions, he extended authority to them as well, and the church functioned in a way that maintained sort of that class system. And they started to preach about how your place in society was your lot in life, and the best thing that you could do was to fulfill that class. And so Charlemagne started charging taxes to people and said, well, here, this is your plot of land. You pledge loyalty to me. And so there's an agreement of protection and provision. I'll give you land. You help protect your region. And you start to see the system of feudalism coming around. And as a result of that, you have people with power who have land, but they also gather the serfs, right? The peasants, the people who work the land. And a result of their working the land, they receive from the Lord some protection and some food, but the peasants work the land and give a percentage of their taxes to the feudal lord and to the church. The church provides some spiritual protection and provision for the people, but also to the state. And so some of the most powerful lords are consulting the priests, the most educated people of society, to help them run the country. And it's about that time that you start to see some of the clothing of the priests start to appear. Right? In my tradition, we are not a robed tradition, but in some, there are some beautiful, amazing vestments and stoles, and even in some, what look like crowns, right? And so you start to see some of these things associated with royalty and power transferred over into the church, exercising its authority and power in society. And so what we see is that the power still remains in the hands of few, but the way that they judge how well they're doing, how successful they are, is by basically identifying how many people are on our land and how much taxes are we bringing in from the folks that are living on our land. It's that social contract, right? So basically what we're saying is, all the people on our land we will provide protection for, but they have to give us something, and it builds our wealth up over time. The feudal lord knows who's on their land and ensures that they pay their proper percentage of taxes. Now, the feudal system works for a long time. You can imagine if Charlemagne was one of the first people to introduce this, even if it was accidental in the 700s, it really lasts for almost 1,000 years, this idea of strict social classism. But it begins to break down, and there are really three major things that break down the system of feudalism. One of them is famine. So what happens when there's a drought or a flood or some sort of infestation of pests? I'm a farmer, so I know how damaging all of these things can be on your crops. There's no guarantee from year to year that you're going to have a successful farm. So what happens if your serfs are working the land and something happens outside of their control? They still have to pay their taxes. They still expect that the feudal lord is going to give them food and provision. But what happens when they pay their taxes and there is no food? That's when things like the French Revolution happen. Off with their heads. They're not providing for us the way that they said they would. They've broken that contract, and so the serfs revolt. So famine is one of those key things, and in fact it did happen in the 1700s. Another reason that feudalism begins to break down is the idea of urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. So people gradually move from an agrarian society to a city. And they don't depend on the land as much, but rather on technology and the industry and the function of those types of things. And so what happens is they move into not broad spaces of land, but rather apartment buildings and tenements. So you have smaller pieces of land with a lot more people in them. And the feudal lord is saying, well, I'm basing my taxes on the number of people and the amount of land that I have, but how do I collect taxes from people that are living together and aren't depending on the land for their well-being. The last thing that breaks down feudalism, and probably the most significant thing, is war. Feudal lords are like any of us. We want to know exactly how powerful we are, and so we start to compare our success. And the way that feudal lords did that is by going to battle and saying, well, if I've got more warriors who are better trained, bigger armies, better knights, we're going to attack the other feudal lord and take over their land. Well, who are the people fighting for the lords? It's the serfs, the peasants. And when they begin to recognize how many of them are sacrificing for the benefit of their master, they start to revolt and they refuse to go to war. And we see how impactful this type of thing happens, especially in World War I, where hundreds of thousands of peasants died as a result of a turf battle. You take all of those factors into consideration, and you have some of these philosophers like John Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith starting to write about a new way of thinking, a new way of life, where classism isn't dictated by the few with power who have some land and allow out of their good graces other people to live there in exchange for the taxes. They start to dream of a place where everyone can have land, not just the powerful few. And they start to expand territory, and that's where America is born. And so the immigrants come over to America and they find this land of wealth and opportunity, expansive land where everyone has access to it, and we leave feudalism far behind in the annals of history, something to study in high school, probably the last time I studied it. And yet, here in this land of opportunity and freedom, feudalism is alive and well. What are the things that you count at your church? Offering? Okay. What are the taxes? And? The people. We are feudal lords. And what we have created is a system that is designed to get exactly what we're getting. Consumers. We are counting who comes and how much money. Ask any pastor at any major church conference, and the first thing out of their mouth is, "Oh, we worship around, and our budget's around attendance and tithe, nickels and noses, budgets and butts." You know, we add all these phrases to sort of make them funny, right? But the truth is, we are a feudalistic system. We have carried over spiritual feudalism. And as a church planter, I'll tell you, we are not exempt from this. When I went to Church Planters Boot Camp back in 2011, we sat in a room with other people getting ready to launch out into church planting for the first time. And my wife and I sat there and we were listening to them talk about the strategies for how you build a church. Right? The alarm bell should have gone off at that moment. How do you build a church? And we said, well, we think we want to start out in homes. And the person leading that session said, well, do you want to get paid? I said, well, sounds great. Yeah, I kind of do. They said, well, people don't bring their checkbooks to your home. And I went, spiritual feudalism is alive and well in church planting as well. Our system is perfectly designed to deliver the results we are getting. We're building consumers who look to us, the feudal lords, to feed and protect them in exchange for their loyalty and their tax. And if our culture is built on this system of attracting consumers, it is almost impossible to disciple them to become producers. Let me say that again. If we are building a system to attract consumers who get fed, it is almost impossible to disciple them to become producers. That's, however, what Jesus is calling us to. Not to build a system to produce consumers, but rather to disciple people into being producers, to make disciples who make disciples who make disciples, so that the world is impacted. Jesus said, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, not so with you. Rather, we are to imitate the way of Jesus and how we interact with people, balancing invitation, yes, with the challenge to grow more and more into the character and competency of Jesus. Let me conclude with some of the final thoughts from that study that I started with a little bit ago. Consider the following conclusion in this what if. This is directly quoted from the study at Willow Creek. They said, imagine the kingdom gains if the church figured out the ideal way to parent Christ followers all along the spiritual continuum. Imagine the impact if all those stalled and dissatisfied people were put back on track and moved into higher stages of spiritual maturity and productivity. Imagine what would happen if the church could create passageways that urge those who are growing and close to Christ to begin leading truly Christ-centered lives. The data from this study suggests that the church provides minimal support for those who are most devoted to Christ. Since these people are best equipped and most motivated advocates for Christ, providing them with increased coaching and parenting and encouragement could reap great gains for the kingdom. One final positive note, those who are most advanced in the spiritual growth continuum state that they have an increasing need for someone to hold me accountable and speak the truth to me. Sounds like an invitation to challenge the people sitting in your pews. That's what we want to do. That's what we're trying to create, is this culture of mission and discipleship. Let me give you just a couple of minutes to reflect on this, and we'll take some time for some Q&A.